So here's kind of what's going on. This is kind of the balance. So if you have basically in a good anti-inflammatory state, leptin's normal, adiponectin's secreted appropriately, IL-10's actually an anti-inflammatory cytokine, then you're doing pretty well. The moment you become overweight, all these cytokines are released. And they can be picked up in blood, they can be picked up in tissue, they definitely are present in psoriatic skin. So it becomes a vicious cycle of self-perpetuating inflammation. So we went back and we actually had, we drew blood on some of our patients coming to clinic, and we had about 100 in each group, and some of the assays worked and some didn't work. And we looked at basically leptin levels and TNF-alpha levels and adiponectin levels in our clinics. These are patients coming to clinic, all prior to therapy. And just to give you a quick sense for how this works, we found basically that certainly TNF-alpha levels were elevated. And now we were comparing psoriasis with psoriatic arthritis. Certainly in people with psoriatic arthritis, TNF levels were even higher. There was a 2.2-fold higher sort of odds of having a higher TNF-alpha level. What was really interesting was the ones who had a higher adiponectin level, they had a low risk of psoriatic arthritis, because adiponectin counters leptin's action, and so it worked pretty well in actually reducing risk. So the effect estimates that are less than 1 suggest that the risk is lower of developing psoriatic arthritis in people who had a higher adiponectin level. In this assay, we didn't see a leptin association, but in future studies after this we did when we had larger sample size. So we were interested more in understanding, if you think about it for a second, so just if you free associate, if the obesity is coming first, something's driving the obesity, and then these people develop psoriasis, right? So what's driving the obesity? So I'm trying to give you a hint here. So, the genes, right? So you probably, there's something, in the genetic package that you come with that predisposes you. And do we have a choice in the genetic package we came with? No. So yeah, so in general, if you think about it, and this is boards related as well a little bit, think about your germline DNA. So all the cells of the body contain the same germline DNA, correct? Could be the liver, hepatocyte, could be a nephron, could be a keratinocyte, could be a macrophage. They have the same germline DNA. Somatic DNA is different because sometimes, the DNA in a particular organ might mutate. You just saw a great example of a mosaic patient who's got some mutations in part of their keratinocytes. So the somatic DNA there is different, but the germline DNA in their blood or generally in their cells is quite normal. Okay, or is their standard, the package it came with. So what we did was we looked back and said, okay, if people come with a package they inherit, could those genes be driving some of this mechanism? So we knew that, and I'm not going to, again, show you large sort of data slides, but just to give you a sense, have all of you heard of genome-wide association studies? Yes? So basically you take a group of people who have disease, like psoriasis, and a group of people who don't have disease, no psoriasis, and you compare their germline polymorphisms, okay? It's kind of a crude study, if you will. You're looking at all these people with psoriasis, all these people without psoriasis, and you're comparing what their polymorphisms are. So we know now there are more than 60 polymorphisms that have been mapped or genotyped that differentiate psoriasis from non-psoriasis. That's what's published out there. What we did was we said, well, amongst the people who have psoriasis and are obese, do any of these polymorphisms matter? Do they drive anything different? Is there any association between these 60 polymorphisms? So I'm not going to show you all that data, but just to show you some data here. So this is basically a large study. We had about 337 people with psoriasis, fully genotyped, 8,000 controls, people without psoriasis. And just if you look at, I'm just going to walk you through this table. It's a bit busy, but basically instead of, we looked at 60-something polymorphisms, but we actually found some interesting results in a couple of them only. So I'm only showing you those. So these are genes that you've heard of before, IL-23 receptor and IL-12B. IL-12B, do you know what IL-12B is? It's all boards fodder. So IL-12B encodes the P40 subunit of which two cytokines? Common to two cytokines. Obviously IL-12 and IL-23, right? So IL-12B is a polymorphism in the IL-12B gene. What we found basically was if people came with the polymorphism, this particular polymorphism, which is this RS number here on the table, it basically affected their risk of psoriasis if they were also obese. So they clearly had an increased risk of psoriasis if they were obese, but if they had this polymorphism specifically, their risk was even further increased. You can look at all the way down this table. You can look at it by BMI, you can look at it by waist circumference, you can look at it by waist-hip ratio, all indices of central versus peripheral obesity. So people with this polymorphism who are also obese have a much higher risk of psoriasis than if they don't have this polymorphism. So what we call these gene-environment interactions or gene-phenotype interactions. We're looking at a polymorphism in the blood, comparing it to a physical characteristic, and we're saying, okay, the two put together compound the risk of psoriasis beyond just one of them alone. Now, isn't that fascinating? What's fascinating about it? The fascinating is, if you go back and look, and I think I'll show you slides about this later, if you go back and look, the IL-12B polymorphisms were some of the first polymorphisms mapped for psoriasis in 2006, 2007. Okay? IL-12B is important for type 2 diabetes, it's important for obesity, IL-23 has been implicated in diabetes as well. So this P40 subunit's very interesting on a metabolic front, right? And so suddenly, this obese patient sitting in front of you, coming back to this patient who's got psoriasis, also has maybe a polymorphism in one of these P40 subunits for IL-12/23. It all suddenly begins to make sense, right? And then, basically sucks you into doing more research because you're like, wow, there's something really interesting going on here. So anyway, so this is the kind of work we were doing, and we got more and more excited. But again, just to remind you, you're talking about basically normal adipose tissue with some calorie restriction, someone with lean body mass, and basically this abnormal adipose tissue. The abnormal adipose tissue may be driving some of this inflammatory disease process. And of course, we know now that people, and I'm going to go into now, next, we know now that people with psoriasis who have severe disease have high risk factors for all of these right down here, atherosclerosis, type 2 diabetes, and so on. So far we've talked about, and I'm just going to go through this a little bit quickly, is we've talked about trying to understand the risk factors for psoriasis. The question is, what do we do about them? Right, so I'm sure I'll show you some more data in a couple minutes, but these are the known risk factors now for psoriasis development, new onset psoriasis. We've talked about obesity, we're thinking about all this metabolic state, we now know about smoking, alcohol, et cetera, but can we make an impact, can we make a dent in, in our psoriasis patient care to help alter these risk factors? So let's talk quickly about some other risk factors that we've published on, other people have published on as well. Let's talk about physical activity. We found, it's very interesting, people who are more physically active tend to have a lower risk of psoriasis. And we've published a couple of papers in this area. What's interesting is the leptinemic state changes. I mean, all of you know that insulin, and I'm not going to insulin today here, but insulin resistance improves with exercise, right? So does leptin resistance. So there's a lot of interesting data here where clinical epidemiology really plays a role. So we found that basically lack of physical activity was actually a risk factor for psoriasis and psoriatic arthritis. Smoking. I'll tell you something interesting about smoking. Rheumatoid arthritis. Very interesting. People with rheumatoid arthritis, they're kind of divided into two groups of people. Those who are positive for a particular antibody called cyclic citrinated peptide. Have you guys heard of that yet? CCP? Okay. So did you know that people with rheumatoid arthritis who are CCP positive are much more likely to be smokers? Because it turns out that what they inhale gets into their lungs and produces a reaction. Some of those antigens gets presented to antigen-presenting cells, through antigen-presenting cells to T cells, and it provokes a CCP reaction. So they get anti-CCP antibodies in their blood, and those people have a slightly different type of RA compared to the non-CCP type of RAs. Now, I'm sure with Dr. Ehrlich and Dr. Friedman, you've seen patients here with psoriasis who smoke, right? Right? What about HS, hidradenitis suppurativa? Do you guys see patients who also smoke? A lot of them smoke. Is it hard to find a patient with hidradenitis suppurativa who doesn't smoke? Yeah, they're rare, but they're there. So psoriasis, certainly there's smoke, and it's very interesting. The data is it's so consistent in many studies. As the rate of smoking goes up, the risk of psoriasis goes up. But what's really interesting is we don't have a biologic correlate for it yet, like CCP in RA. A lot of us are working in this area, but this is where we need some youngsters. We're going to leave some loose ends here. They've got to leave something behind for some of the youngsters coming up. But there are some loose ends, and we'd love to have people sort of exploring this. Smoking and psoriatic arthritis, same risk, increases risk. We don't know how, we don't know the mechanism, but it certainly seems to be implicated. So smoking is a well-known risk factor for psoriasis and psoriatic arthritis. And then alcohol intake. This study got a lot of press. We found that women who were drinking a certain amount of alcohol had an increased risk of psoriasis, and it was driven by beer. Not interesting? So we looked at all types of alcohol, but it was beer. Now, it was very interesting. It wasn't all types of beer. It was a particular type of beer. What types of beer are there? Have you? Again, well, you know, so I'll say I'm a lumper, and I'm also a dichotomizer. So most I'll do is dichotomize the world. Have you guys heard people? There are two types of people in the world. Those that dichotomize, those that don't dichotomize. So if you think about beer, there's non-light beer and light beer. So the women who were drinking non-light beer, regular beer, had an increased risk of psoriasis. So it spawned a whole area of research for us. So what do you think, why? Any thoughts? Why would non-light beer, why would regular...
How did their BMI tie in with that?
The BMI, it was independent of BMI. Great question, Dr. Early. Sugar, calories? Yeah, possible. We compared to body mass index, weight to ratio. We adjusted for all the metabolic risk factors. The brewing process is a good question. So what do you think about the brewing process? I don't drink any beer, so I have no idea, but who enjoys, what is the difference? There's a particular nutrient, gluten. So what gives the beer its calories? It's gluten, right? All that. So depending on, so there's many types of gluten-type proteins. There's a protein from barley called hordein. There's a protein from wheat called gliadin, right? So it turns out that non-light beer is the only alcoholic beverage with a very high concentration of gluten. Wine, how much gluten does wine have? 0 or minimum. Doesn't have any. So that's why, you know, if you go to a restaurant nowadays, there's a gluten-free menu, isn't there? Most restaurants, right? And so people who have gluten-sensitive enteropathies can have wine. They just can't drink beer. So there are gluten-free beers now, right? Okay, so we found this, and this hit the papers, and this was all over the news, and you know there were these, because the study was done in women. There were pictures of beer guzzling women all over the press. I mean, that was not the intention, but this went up all over the place, and I just picked some pictures from the press releases that came out. So it spawned a whole area of interest for us, and so we are now doing a fair amount of work. One of our nutritional epidemiologists in the department, Dr. An-Young Cho, is doing work in this area of gluten and psoriasis risk. So we've built gluten variables. We have data where we sample populations every 4 years with studies called the food frequency questionnaires. We can estimate exactly, that's an oxymoron, but estimate basically through their food intake the amount of gluten they're taking. So we're looking at how gluten might impact risk of psoriasis and psoriatic arthritis. But it's a fascinating area. And we're thinking about all these risk factors. Again, they might still be linked to caloric intake again.